The wagon jolted to a stop on the edge of Dust Creek, Montana territory, and Sarah Mitchell stepped down into a world that looked like God had forgotten it. August heat shimmered off the bare dirt street. Two women watched from a mercantile window, their faces pale behind dusty glass. A dog lay panting in the shade of a water trough. The town clerk met her at what should have been the schoolhouse. Instead, she found herself staring at a rectangle of blackened timber and ash. Fire took it in June, the clerk said. Hat in his hands, he was perhaps 50. Sunburned. Embarrassed. During the drought, folks talked about rebuilding. But he gestured at the ruins, then at the struggling town beyond. We got more pressing concerns. Miss Mitchell, I expect you'll want to catch the next stage back to Helena. Sarah set down her traveling bag. Two trunks sat in the wagon behind her books mostly. Primers and readers and poetry she'd carried across half a continent. She'd signed a contract. She'd burned bridges back in Philadelphia. Her father's final words still rang in her ears. Teaching is wasted ambition for a woman of your station. She walked to the edge of the burnt foundation and knelt. The ash was still faintly warm in her palm. Fine as flour, she found a piece of charred wood that might have been a desk leg, a melted brass bell half buried in the debris. I'll need slate boards, she said, standing and brushing off her skirts with deliberate care. And I saw a cottonwood tree near the creek on the way in. That'll do for shade. The clerk stared at her. You're planning to teach anyway. That's what I came here to do. He opened his mouth, closed it, finally nodded. The boarding house is 2 streets over. Mrs. Jensen's expecting you. Best of luck. Miss Mitchell. Sarah watched him walk away. The sun beat down on the ash pile. Somewhere, a shutter banged in the hot wind. She thought about the letter she'd written her sister 3 weeks ago. I'm going somewhere I can make a difference. Somewhere people need what I can give. The boarding house door stuck when she tried it. She had to put her shoulder against the wood and shove. It gave with a screech of warped timber. Inside, the room was small and close. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked onto the back of the mercantile. She unpacked her trunk of books methodically, arranging them on the rickety shelf in the corner. McGuffey's Readers, a worn copy of Longfellow, the Shakespeare her mother had given her before she died. The books had never failed her. People were more complicated. She sat on the bed and let herself feel the weight of what she'd done. The burnt schoolhouse, the suspicious eyes, the heat that made breathing feel like work. For just a moment, she allowed herself to wonder if her father had been right. Then she stood, straightened her spine, and began planning tomorrow's first lesson. Sarah rang the handbell at dawn on the 3rd day. The sound carried sharp and clear across the empty street. She stood beneath the massive cottonwood tree near the creek, slate boards stacked beside her, waiting. For 10 minutes, nothing. Then a boy appeared. Perhaps 8 years old, barefoot and suspicious. You the teacher. I am a Sarah Mitchell. What's your name? Tommy Grant. He edged closer, eyeing the slate boards. My ma said you was crazy for trying. Your mother might be right. Are you going to sit down anyway? He did. Within the hour, 3 more children had appeared, 2 girls in faded calico dresses, another boy who couldn't have been more than 6. By the end of the week, she had 8 students. Sarah taught outside the rhythms she'd learned in Philadelphia's rigid classrooms. She drew letters in the dust with sticks. She used creek stones for counting, arranging them in patterns that made the children laugh. She told stories about the alphabet coming to life, about numbers that could build bridges and calculate distances. The children responded. Young Tommy Grant traced letters in the creek mud with his finger, his whole face transformed by concentration. The oldest girl, Anna, devoured every word Sarah spoke, hungry for something Sarah recognized because she'd felt it herself once. But it was the mothers Sarah felt most acutely. They watched from windows and porches, arms crossed, judging whether this Eastern woman understood anything about their lives, whether she'd last passed the first hard frost. One woman watched every day from her porch across the creek, older, perhaps 60, gray hair pulled back severe. She never approached, never smiled, just watched with eyes that seemed to measure and find wanting. On Friday, When the children had left and Sarah was gathering the slate boards, she felt those eyes still on her. She looked up. The woman on the porch met her gaze directly, then turned and went inside. Sarah walked back to the boarding house in the dusk, hearing the children's voices still echoing in her mind. 8 students, not the 30 the contract had promised, but 8 minds opening to possibility. She passed the gray-haired woman's house. The porch was empty now, but a lamp burned in the window. Sarah wondered what the woman was doing with her evening, wondered what she thought about the schoolteacher who'd refused to leave. Their eyes had met for just a moment, long enough for Sarah to feel something pass between them, not hostility exactly, but not welcome either, something closer to recognition. Catherine Brennan spoke to her first in the mercantile, 2 weeks after school started. Sarah was examining seed packets, trying to understand what she'd need for a winter garden. "You'll starve come winter if you don't learn to preserve food proper." Sarah turned. The woman from the porch stood behind her, blunt and direct. "I'm Catherine Brennan. You're wasting your time with those seeds. Planting season's done. What you need now is to learn how to make what's left last till spring." She paused. "I could teach you in exchange for reading lessons." Sarah blinked. "You want to learn to read?" "Never had the chance. Felt the lack of it my whole life." Catherine's jaw tightened. "Seems like a fair trade, my knowledge for yours." "It's more than fair," Sarah said quietly. "When do we start?" Catherine's kitchen smelled of sage and preserving vinegar. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, showing Sarah how to pack vegetables in jars, how to recognize when meat was properly dried, which wild plants could be eaten and which would kill you. "Lost my husband 2 years back," Catherine said during their 3rd session, not looking up from the cucumbers she was slicing. "William knew how to read some, used to read almanacs to me in the evenings. I'd sit there thinking how I'd give near anything to read those words myself." Sarah arranged alphabet cards on the table letters she'd written on the backs of recipe cards. "Start with your name, Catherine." Catherine's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the letters. A woman who could butcher a deer and survive alone for 2 years, trembling over letters on a card. "I feel foolish," Catherine said. "You're not. You're brave." They worked in comfortable silence, Sarah learning how to properly seal jars, Catherine practicing her letters. The exchange felt perfectly balanced, knowledge flowing both directions like water finding its level. When Sarah mangled her first attempt at pickling, they both laughed, real laughter, the kind that comes from a shared effort and mutual respect. Walking home that evening with her first jar of preserved tomatoes, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. She'd come to Montana thinking she'd teach reading. She hadn't expected to need teaching herself. She looked back at Catherine's house. The lamp still burned in the window. Sarah imagined Catherine sitting at her table, practicing the letters of her own name, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the late summer heat. This was why she'd come west, not to civilize anyone, not to impose her knowledge on grateful recipients, to participate, to exchange, to be part of something that required both giving and receiving. September brought no rain. The creek dropped to a trickle. On the morning Sarah arrived to find children clustered around the town well, she knew before anyone spoke, went dry overnight. Thomas Grant said. He was perhaps 35, lean and weathered. "Mary's husband and Tommy's father. We'll have to haul from the creek now. Line's already forming." School attendance dropped by half that week. The children who remained looked exhausted, hands blistered from carrying buckets. Sarah joined the waterline herself the second morning, understanding that drought was a crisis that made no exceptions for schoolteachers. She stood behind Mary Grant, who was visibly pregnant and struggling with a yoke across her shoulders. Neither woman spoke. They just waited in line as the sun climbed higher, then hauled their buckets back through streets that had given up pretending to be anything but desperate. By the 3rd day, tempers frayed. 2 men argued over who'd taken more than their share. A woman wept quietly while her children waited with empty buckets. Sarah heard Thomas Grant talking to another rancher near the mercantile. "There's documents about water rights being passed around, legal papers. But I can't." He stopped, jaw tight with shame. That evening, Sarah understood. Thomas appeared at her boarding house with 4 other men, and all looking uncomfortable. "Miss Mitchell, we heard you're educated. Wondered if you might—" Thomas held out a sheaf of papers. "We need these read. Need to know if we're being cheated." Sarah took the documents. "Sit down. I'll read every word." They gathered on Mrs. Jensen's porch 5 men who'd worked since dawn hauling water, who'd come to a schoolteacher because they couldn't read the words that might determine their family's survival. Sarah read slowly, explaining the legal language, answering questions about clauses and obligations. When the others had left, Thomas lingered. "Never told anyone I couldn't read," he said, looking at his boots. "Felt like admitting I was less than—" Sarah thought about the 40 buckets of water she'd watched him carry that day, thought about his gentleness with his son, his quiet competence with horses and tools. "You just carried 40 buckets of water in heat that nearly killed me," she said. "You're not less than anything. Mr. Grant." He met her eyes then, nodded once. "Appreciate that, Miss Mitchell." Walking back to her room, Sarah thought about literacy not as moral improvement but as protection, as power. These men needed reading not for culture but for survival, and she'd been teaching children while adults went vulnerable through a world of contracts and legal documents. The drought was teaching her something the burnt schoolhouse hadn't. Education wasn't about what she'd planned to give, it was about what people actually needed. The first hard freeze came in late October. Sarah arrived at the cottonwood tree to find ice crusting the creek edges, the ground too cold for children to sit. School was over until spring. She'd known it was coming but hadn't prepared for the hollow feeling it left. Catherine found her staring at the frozen creek. "What if families opened their homes one night a week? We've got candles and lamps. You could teach by firelight. I can't ask people to—" "You're not asking. I am." Catherine's eyes held something fierce. "You taught me to read my own name. Sarah Mitchell, now let me help you teach others." Catherine organized it herself. The first night was at Thomas and Mary Grant's house. Their cabin was small, 1 main room with a cook stove, a sleeping loft where the children bunked, a table that could barely seat 6. But when Sarah arrived with her books and slates, she found the table scrubbed clean, candles lit, and the whole family waiting. Tommy and his siblings sat on one side. Thomas stood awkwardly near the stove. Mary, heavy with pregnancy, wiped her hands on her apron. "We'd like to learn too," Thomas said. "If that's acceptable." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "It's more than acceptable." They worked by candlelight and lamp glow. Shadows danced on the log walls, the smell of fresh bread mixed with wood smoke. Sarah taught the children their letters while Thomas sat beside his youngest son, both of them copying the letter A with the same careful concentration. Mary joined halfway through, pulling a chair to the table. "Never too late." "I figure." The intimacy of the setting transformed everything. This wasn't the public performance of outdoor teaching. This was communion, sacred work happening in the warm heart of a family's home. When Sarah left 2 hours later, stepping into the frozen night, she looked back at the candlelit windows, the shadow of Thomas bent over his slate, learning beside his children, walking home, her breath forming clouds in the starlit air. Sarah thought, this is what church should feel like. Not performance or obligation, just people gathered in lamplight, passing knowledge hand to hand, making themselves more than they'd been when darkness fell. December ground them all down. The rotating lessons continued Monday at the Grants, Wednesday at Catherine's, Friday at the Miller farm, but illness swept through the families. A bad respiratory infection that left people hollow-eyed and coughing. Sarah felt it coming on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she was feverish, barely able to stand. Mrs. Jensen called for Catherine, who came with her medicine bag and competent hands. For 2 weeks, Sarah drifted in and out of fever dreams. She heard herself talking broken fragments about Philadelphia, about her father's study where he'd told her teaching was wasted ambition, about the fiancé who'd wanted her decorative and quiet, not passionate about ideas. "You're not wasted here." Catherine's voice came through the fever, cool cloth on her forehead. "You're the opposite of wasted." When the fever finally broke, Sarah woke to weak winter sunlight and crushing exhaustion. Catherine sat in the chair beside her bed. "Knitting." "How long?" Sarah's voice came out rough. 2 weeks. "You talked quite a bit in the fever." Catherine's needles clicked. About running away, about a man who didn't deserve you, and about a father who should have known better. Sarah closed her eyes. I didn't come here to help anyone. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. Most people who do good things have complicated reasons for doing them. Catherine set down her knitting. Doesn't make the good things less good. But when Catherine left, Sarah lay staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of winter pressing down. School attendance had dropped. People were focused on simple survival. What was she doing here? Teaching reading in a place where staying alive took everything people had. Her sister's letter lay on the bedside table, forwarded from Philadelphia. You've proved your point. Come back before you waste your whole life out there. Sarah thought about spring, about the stage that would carry her back to civilization, about admitting defeat. The teaching material sat in the corner, gathering dust. Sarah recovered slowly. By mid-January, she was strong enough to attend Catherine's lesson, though she'd privately decided this would be her last. She'd announce in spring that she was leaving, write a proper resignation letter to the school board such as it was. When she arrived at Catherine's house, she found not just Catherine but 7 adults waiting, Thomas and Mary Grant, 2 ranchers she'd read documents for, the Miller couple, a young man named James who worked at the livery. Thomas spoke first. Miss Mitchell, we built something here. Don't know what to call it exactly, but it's our. Thought you should know that. Built something. Sarah's voice came out small. Mary stepped forward. We've been practicing together, between your lessons, teaching each other what we learn. Thomas has been helping James with his letters. I've been working with Mrs. Miller on her numbers. You don't need me anymore? Sarah said. And wasn't sure if she felt relieved or devastated. That's not... Thomas stopped, choosing his words carefully. We started because of you, but what we built belongs to all of us now. We just wanted you to know. We'd be disappointed if you left, but we'd keep going either way. Catherine was watching her with knowing eyes. You were planning to leave, weren't you? Sarah couldn't lie. I thought, what's the point? You can all teach yourselves now. The point, Catherine said quietly, is that you're part of this. Not the whole thing, not the only teacher, but part of it, unless you don't want to be. Sarah looked around the room, at Thomas, who could now read simple texts, at Mary, who'd learned her numbers, at James, whose face had lit up the first time he'd read his own name. She thought about her sister's letter, still sitting on her bedside table, about resignation and retreat. I want to be part of it, she said, walking home later. She stopped at her room long enough to find her sister's letter. She carried it to Catherine's house and fed it to the kitchen stove. Watching the paper curl and blacken, Catherine stood beside her. You staying then? I am. Simple words, final ones. March brought the thaw, mud and melt and the slow return of possibility. During a Sunday gathering at the Mercantile, someone mentioned the burnt schoolhouse foundation. Shame it's still just sitting there, Mrs. Miller said. Come spring. Be nice to have a proper school again. Takes money to build, another voice said, which none of us have. Thomas Grant, who'd been quiet, spoke up. Don't need money, need hands. The room went silent. Then someone laughed. You saying we should build it ourselves? Why not? Thomas looked around. We got carpenters, got people who can haul timber, got families who could contribute what they can labor. Materials, meals for workers. Wouldn't be fancy, but it'd be ours. Sarah watched this happen without speaking. They weren't asking her permission. They were deciding for themselves. The work began the following Monday and continued for 4 weeks. Different families took different tasks. The Millers had a stand of trees they could spare for lumber. Thomas and 2 others knew framing. James turned out to have a talent for finish work. Sarah showed up each morning with everyone else, not to direct or supervise, but to carry lumber and hammer nails and hold beams steady while others secured them. Catherine organized meal rotations, different families bringing food each day. Everyone eating together at noon. The children mixed mortar and carried water. Important enough to be given real tasks. Thomas explained carpentry terms as he worked, using vocabulary he'd learned through reading lessons. This here's a mortise joint. Has to fit tight or the whole frame will be weak. The building rose slowly, post by post, beam by beam. A structure taking shape not because someone had given it to them, but because they'd chosen to create it together. On the day they raised the roof, the whole town turned out. Even people who hadn't helped with construction came to watch. Sarah stood in the crowd, just another person, watching the final beams go into place. When the last nail was driven, no one cheered. They were all too tired. They just stood together, looking at what their hands had made. Thomas's youngest son tugged his father's sleeve. "We really built that, Pa. We really did." The boy ran to Sarah. "You helped too. Miss Mitchell, I saw you carrying lumber." "I did. Just like everyone else." Just like everyone else. The words felt true in a way nothing had since she'd arrived in Montana. The dedication was supposed to be formal, but like everything else in Dust Creek, it became something simpler and more honest. Families brought food not because anyone had organized it, but because that's what you did when something mattered. Children ran through the new building, their voices echoing off fresh-cut lumber. Adults stood in small groups, talking and laughing, exhausted but satisfied. Thomas's son had carved a sign, "Dust Creek School, built by our hands, 1883. Thomas read it aloud to the gathering, his voice steady and clear. Sarah watched Mary's face as her husband read, saw the pride there. Someone suggested Sarah should say words. She looked at Catherine instead. "You should speak." Catherine stood in the doorway, looking out at the assembled families. "We built this together because we decided we needed it, not because someone told us to, not because anyone came to save us. We saved ourselves." With Sarah's help and each other's labor, that's what I'll remember, that we did this ourselves. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, realizing she'd stopped being the schoolmarm weeks ago. She was Sarah now, Catherine's friend, Mary's reading partner, the woman who'd carried lumber alongside Thomas Grant. Her trunks of books sat inside the new building, but they'd been supplemented by almanacs and seed catalogs, recipe collections and stock reports, texts born from the community's actual life, not her imported ideas about what they should read. People began drifting home as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Sarah stayed, standing in the doorway as lamplight began to glow in distant windows. She thought about the first time she'd stood here, looking at nothing but ash and broken promises. She'd thought the school was the building, thought education was something she possessed and would distribute. Now she understood. The school had always been the people. The candlelit circles in small cabins, the reciprocal learning, Catherine's hands teaching preservation, Sarah's voice teaching letters, Thomas explaining carpentry terms he'd learned to read. Education was light passed hand to hand in darkness, and the darkness was less dark now. She looked at her own hands scarred from construction, stained with ink, competent in ways they hadn't been when she'd arrived. Teachers' hands, builders' hands, neighbors' hands. The door behind her opened easily, no longer stuck, no longer locked. It belonged to everyone now. Sarah stepped inside, lit a candle, and sat at one of the new desks. She pulled out paper and began writing not a letter to her sister, not a lesson plan, just her own name. In careful letters, Sarah Mitchell, teacher, neighbor, home, outside. The last of the daylight faded, inside. Candlelight made shadows dance on new wood. Tomorrow there would be students, children, and adults both, learning together in the space they'd built with their own hands. But tonight, Sarah just sat in the quiet, feeling the weight and warmth of belonging, of being part of something that required both giving and receiving, of being known not for what she'd brought to Montana, but for what she'd learned here. The candle burned steady, the door stood open, and the darkness outside was a little less dark than it had been.